Hello, everybody. Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the Tornado Alert journalism session. We are in a safe zone here, so I think it's going to be okay. There is a tornado alert outside. Thank you very much for joining us and for taking the risk. My name is Mark Nelson. I'm the Senior Director in charge of the Center for International Media Assistance here at the National Endowment for Democracy. So we're really glad to see you all here today for this discussion about data journalism and how it derives results in developing countries. We decided to organize this in cooperation with Internews, and very happy to have this partnership with Internews. And we're also very pleased to welcome this panel of distinguished guests. To my left is Ida Yusta, who is the country director for Internews Kenya, where she leads a portfolio of health, digital media, human rights, democracy, and governance related to journalism training in Kenya. Ben Colmery is next. He's the director of the Knight International Journalism Fellowship at ICFJ. Sorry? Deputy Director, sorry.
Fair to my boss.
I'll talk to him about that. He works on project development, digital innovation, and monitoring and evaluation. Craig Hammer next to me is an old colleague from the World Bank. He's not so old, but he's a colleague. At the World Bank Institute, he leads the governance, the Global Media and Development Program at the World Bank Institute. And that focuses on information and media as drivers of good governance. And finally, it's Tara Susman-Peña, who is a senior research officer at Internews in the Innovation and Learning Center. And she authored the report, which we had some copies of outside. So I'm really glad to have this very relevant panel together today. What our point is today is to think about data journalism as an entry point for engaging with communities in a different way. This is about how data journalism and the explosion of data that has come on the market through digital technologies, how it may create a new kind of opportunity for the media development field to reach out to different sectors of development like health, education, agriculture, public finance management, and those kinds of things. And it also may be to make advances on something that right now is not going in the right direction, and that is the whole enabling environment for the media freedoms, and the overall acceptability of journalism in our societies. Most countries that we're going to be talking about here today in developing countries face enormous challenges. And we've seen over the past 20 years, there's really not been any increase in media freedom. There's not really been very much progress in terms of, if you measure media systems, they're quite stagnant, and there's been an enormous number of countries that are cracking down on journalists, and journalists are often in danger, and just doing the basic things of journalism are quite difficult. So that's the background that we're working with here today. And the question that we're going to be looking at is this digital revolution, the fact that people now have access to more data and have more devices and more opportunities to get to that data, is it changing the conversation on social media? Because it has been quite an interesting amount of interest in this event from social media. So if you are interested in doing that, it's CIMA events. I'm going to start first with Ida to ask you to start us off talking about Kenya. Kenya was a place that in 2011 came up with this open data initiative and this very promising start on something that we thought would be quite a change in the way the country released information and how citizens would have access to information. So it created a new environment. There's been mixed results and mixed sort of reviews of how it's worked. Maybe you could tell us a little bit of how things are going in Kenya. What do you see as the main accomplishments of what's happened at that level, and where you see this going at this point?
Yes, thanks a lot, Mark, and thanks for the opportunity for this discussion. I think it's not going to be us talking to you, but I think we all have only 5 to 7 minutes, so I'll be really brief and say, yes, CODI, or the Kenya Open Data Initiative, we all thought was an amazing opportunity, which we at Internews in Kenya did grab, but there's a lot of but around it in terms of what's required to make Cody work for citizens and for journalists. And I just also want to say this discussion is just so relevant today because, I mean, from the title that's very upbeat and very promising, the look and shape of journalism in Kenya. You see these really kind of engaging visualizations in the media now, but more importantly, the analysis and the narratives behind them are making impact and are allowing citizens to see new insights that just weren't there before. So my story could be really short and sweet because we only have 5 minutes, and say it's successful, there's impact, it has helped drive the development agenda. But it is a slightly longer story and a slightly more nuanced story than that. So I would like to talk to you a little bit also about how we got there. How did we get to these stories in the media? The why did we do it? And then, of course, a little bit about the what next, as you said. And so just to elaborate a little bit more on the impact, one of the stories I'm really proud of, if you can imagine, in the environment in Kenya, surrounded by countries like Uganda and other really extremely homophobic, and we work from the basis of an HIV program, is the story about men who have sex with men, which is a very important story in the HIV world because it's a most at-risk population, as it is termed. Men who have sex with men are 5 times more likely to be HIV infected than other men and women. So it's a story that has to be told because of the large risk, but it's a story that cannot be told if you don't have evidence. If it's a story that seems like advocacy for homosexuality, or if it's a story that has to be told through a sort of sympathy factor, it's not going to wash in Kenya. But if you can have a story, which we did have, which showed visually, through these visualizations that you see in some of those stories, what happens, what is the typical day in a story of a man who has sex with another man, and of course representing the 800,000 or so who have already identified as homosexual in Kenya, how difficult it is to tell that story in an otherwise hostile environment. Data provides that opportunity because you can literally say it's so many times more likely, so many times less likely for others, etc. And so the stories do speak for themselves, but it really has been quite a journey to get there. With data, I mean, we all know about the kind of the different, the whole new lexicon that has sprung up because of data and because of data journalism. I mean, you can scrape data, you can clean data, you can analyze data, you present data, you can narrativize data, visualize data. And all of that implies that there is a lot behind it. I mean, if you look at Cody that Mark referred to, the Kenya Open Data Initiative, and you click on it, it might hold promise because there are certainly lots of data sets on there, but you and I can't just go to that set and say, oh, this means this, or there's a trend in this part of the country that suggests malaria is on the increase or anything like that, not at all. So the how we got there was a lot about a major reality check about what the level of data literacy had actually been among Kenyan journalists. We had made a lot of assumptions that got us, caught us on the wrong footing, if I may say so, right at the beginning, because we assumed that journalists knew what it meant to say 50% or 70% of people prefer this over that. So ratios, relative values, percentages, and all of those kind of general popular statistical terms that we may take for granted aren't necessarily known to a generalist Kenyan journalist, and perhaps also not in the States or in many other countries of the world. So that's the steps back we had to take. We had to take the steps back that related to some disappointments around Cody, as you said. A lot of the data is not clean, and what's normally meant by that is that it doesn't necessarily compare apples and apples. So you might be comparing a fruit salad with a banana, and what it takes to be able to understand that and get that takes serious statistical analysis, data science knowledge, etc. Another how did we get there thing that was really important for us to understand was that because before the advent of this open data culture and the launch of the Kenya Open Data Initiative, journalists in Kenya didn't necessarily think they had the right to request for data. In other parts of the world, perhaps in the UK, where it's been standard for journalists to have access through data, through academics, through government departments, journalists insist on that right. But if data had always been in dusty filing cabinets or in somebody's head or in, in a printout somewhere and not online and not even available through requests, it takes a mind shift to get journalists to understand, we are actually allowed to get this data. This data is available, and we must be able to manipulate the data. So that's a kind of a reality check that we needed to make. We also realized that it takes a village. Often the best journalists, certainly this is the case in Kenya, are print journalists who work analytically, who work as lone wolves all on their own. But for data journalism to succeed, you need teams of people who actually manage a data journalism project together. You need, of course, a journalist who can write well. You need people who can have insights from data, who can either stare at data for long enough and see the insights, or know the tools and the skills with which to manipulate the data to get to those insights. You need somebody to visualize the data, because ultimately the audience needs to understand it. You need coders and developers. We need to be sure in this open data and this kind of open source culture that whatever we've discovered is in turn turned onto something that goes online. So really a data journalism team may comprise of 5 people. And we had to learn how to do the training of the 5 people, not least of which meant the 5 of them working together to get to a data journalism project. So the how did we get there has been a journey that has now had this impact, the impact that we can see from the stories in the media, but it had there were a lot of hard bumps along the way. The why we do it, for me, seems so obvious now because we do it all the time, but perhaps it's worth mentioning it. As Mark said, it is an opportunity. It is no longer the special place of a journalist to report that something happened. Anybody with a cell phone can do that. Anybody who can take a picture can say, this event happened, and can be a witness to that, and perhaps even a really credible witness to it. The journalist's role has become, and we're working very hard on carving out a sort of real niche role, new niche role for journalists about what it means that it happened, which simply means that social media and mainstream media, this evidence-based mainstream media, happily coexist, because the best data journal projects are then again turned into online pieces, and vice versa. So you still need to know that something happened, but much more importantly, journalists can help citizens understand what the significance of it is and what the meaning of it is. And the other why of it is that, of course, that in some contexts where there is a lot of political deference, it might be that journalists think it's important enough to say it is so because the president said so, or the senator said so, or the governor of this county said so, or my tribe said so, or my father said so. So in other words, the he said, she said journalism that can really just be a sort of flinging about of different opinion is completely done away with if you have evidence to support a story, and if journalists don't have to feel that they have to justify why they're advancing a certain point. And of course the other part of the why is the incredible impact related to the stories. Valerie, could you show a little bit on oh yeah, it's behind you, behind me. So part of the how did we get there is also to consider, the intensive training that was involved. So by the way, I think in this audience, a lot of people do know what Internews does, but just in case you don't know, we work very much behind the scenes. We train journalists in the various environments in Kenya and in, I think, 30 other countries in the world. Our mission is always to sort of move in where we believe media can make a difference. Now, sometimes it's a humanitarian difference, and sometimes it is about complex human rights issues. In a very complex and advanced media environment like Kenya, we think we can make a difference through this analytical, in-depth journalism at the moment, and in the ways in which it applies to human rights governance issues with a new devolved system in Kenya. But I was talking about the why and how we got there. So we created so through these sort of head bumps that I was talking about, and through realizing just how complex and intense this work is, we realized also that journalists needed a tool to be able to access, and so we created this tool called Data Dredger, where these teams that we also employ at Internews, who are coders, developers, data scientists, analysts, and so on, take some of the data that is available on Cody. And I have to say, we work with a lot of data that isn't on Cody. A lot of public health data, WHO data, or demographic health surveys, etc. And we post them online, and of course, if we just did that, they wouldn't lead to stories. We find narratives in the data, we then visualize them, but we do provide the background sourcing, and then journalists can download either the visualizations or the data sets themselves, can interact with us and ask us, whether their hunch about a different trend was true, etc., etc. So if you scroll down Data Dredger, you'll see some of these visualizations and how kind of like engaging they are, and then how that would kind of attract stories in the Kenyan media. If you go right down to the bottom, one of the stories I'm most proud of is a story series that appeared in The Standard, which is a mainstream newspaper in Kenya, and of course read by opinion makers and opinion leaders and so on. And if you click on that app, it is sort of really perhaps one of the best examples of journalists and coders and developers getting together and helping journalists, and thereby helping citizens coming to new insights. So the big thing in Kenya is devolution. Since the new constitution and the election of over 2 years ago, Kenya is devolved into 47 counties. So that has created 47 new seats of power. Some may say 47 new potential seats of poor governance, but it can be 47 of really great governance that can help citizens' voices be heard, but that need analysis and that need checks, that needs the watchdogging that media can do. And so this developer, coder, and journalist team that we trained developed this app, and through the data journalism skills that they've learned, they were able to track the different budgets in the different counties and come to really, really wonderful insights about what the government hadn't considered when budgeting for health. For instance, the government hadn't considered that in the 47 counties there are very different health needs. I mean, it's a fairly large country. There are areas with very high HIV prevalence. There are areas with HIV prevalence under 1%. There are malaria endemic areas, and there are areas where cholera is a problem because of sanitation. And so the kind of the budgeting for health had been kind of more or less equally passed out to the 47 counties, which our data analysis quickly showed didn't make sense, because you needed to, of course, budget more for HIV in high HIV prevalence areas, to use the simplest example. So the impact of this story, and this really drives back to what we are talking about, is how it can drive the development agenda, is that the two of the governors whose counties had been showed up for having done poor budgeting, if you like, actually approached the journalists who had done it and said, how did you find this out? This is embarrassing, but it's something we needed to know. That's something we ought to have done ourselves before. And it led to a real engagement involving really serious partners. And I mean, Craig is here. In Kenya, we work a lot with the World Bank itself to kind of help us verify some of our findings, because these are still journalists who are generalists, so who sometimes have a hunch, but it needs to be verified. And that project in itself, for me, is one of the single most important reasons why data journalism is so important. Because for the first time, journalists were able to not only have their stories taken so seriously that in this particular case, it was a front page story over 5 days in the Standard, but that the governor actually got back to the journalist and said, tell us how you do it. To me, that constructive journalism, the part of journalism that can be constructive criticism, that I think those in the development field should take note of, because often journalists are, just the bad watchdogs, only see bad news. But in this case, it was like, how did you do it? And they actually sat down together and were taken through the steps. So, I mean, I think that's about it. I mean, that's a really high impact story.
That's a great place to stop for right now, because I think it really is a terrific example of opening a conversation with a group that might have otherwise had quite different opinions about the role of journalists in society. Suddenly you're in a conversation both with the government and with citizens about something that really matters to them. So that it's the kind of thing that we think that we're driving at here. Yeah. Can that happen more often, and can we find more examples of this? So that gives us a chance to go to Ben from ICFJ. You guys have also done this kind of work with some interesting results similar to this kind of outcome. And I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about some of the problems that you were trying to solve through your work on data journalism.
Well, thank you. Everybody hear me? Great. So, I mean, I think in order to engage this, I think we have to go with a basic assumption that access to information is essential to driving economic and social outcomes. I think if we don't start there, then this conversation doesn't really go very far. And one of the real issues that we're up against, just kind of socially and politically, is a lack of transparency. And I'm going to be focusing, just for the context, I'm going to be focusing on, to some extent, Latin America and to some extent, Africa. So these are the environments I'm speaking about. So there's a real problem with transparency and a lack of oversight. Government is doing business in ways that citizens simply can't really see how it's actually happening. Contracts are being signed, and money is being spent without really knowing where that money is going. There's also investments being made that are having environmental devastation and threatening people's well-being. In addition, in terms of data as a solution for some of this, there's a real lack of open data. There are certainly pockets of this available. If you look at like the city of Buenos Aires in Argentina has been a leader in this space. And there have been some in different parts of the world. You reference Kenya has certainly been a leader of sorts. But as a blanket, open data still doesn't really exist. And even when it does, especially in the case of Kenya, you're talking about information that is often just unreadable for a machine, big data dumps and PDFs and so on. You can put this stuff out there, but that doesn't mean it's really accessible data. And oftentimes it's just very disaggregated and hard to connect. So there might be some data here, some data here, some data here. How can you do anything meaningful with data to solve these problems? And then in addition, just generally, there is a real problem with a feedback loop and really giving citizens a voice. Solving social and political and economic problems in a way where citizens aren't really engaged into the problem solving. And I reference these because I think data journalism offers opportunities for solving these kinds of things and operating in very difficult environments. And I think media, it's important to think about, as I hear, there's a small investment being made in media development. I find that very alarming, considering how important access to quality information is and what media can provide that other stakeholders can't. Media, and you'll hear me, if you're familiar with our night fellow, Justin Arenstein, you're going to hear some of him come through and what I have to say, but a lot of our work has been driven around the idea of media as mass mobilizers, as a built-in institution that can engage audiences. Media also has a methodology for surfacing truth. And media, journalism without data ends up being largely anecdote. So data is essential to this in order to actually have real evidence and to fact check what the experts are saying, both data sets they might be putting forward, but also just the mere statements they're making. And media can have an impact when we're talking about on macro indicators and trying to really change sectors that impact people's lives. I mean, media can impact government spending. It can impact corporate behavior. It can impact health interventions, environmental policy, and so on. So media is essential to this. And the other thing is, media is a relatively cheap investment. A lot of the projects, and I want to present some to you, but a lot of the projects can be done very cheaply, and the funding can actually, you can get a lot out of relatively little money. Instead of having to spend millions and billions, you can oftentimes spend thousands, depending on the size of the program, but you can actually achieve a kind of scale in a cost-effective way through media. And I think that gives media a real advantage that's being underutilized. And so I'd like to talk about a few projects that I think get inside of this pretty nicely. The first one I want to show is if you're not familiar, La Nación in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, has been a real leader in the data journalism movement in Latin America. And we have had the fortune of being able to work with them at a stage of this in which we actually had a night fellow, Sandra Crucinelli, embedded within the organization, within the data team, to help really improve the integration with the journalists and the workflows. And through this, they've been able to do a lot of deep investigative. Now, our fellow's not there now, but she was a part of that process. But they've done some amazing work in investigative journalism, things like uncovering when the government is giving contracts, transportation subsidy contracts to pro-government vendors over, making a real, truly competitive process. And because of their journalism surfacing this through data, have been able to drive the government to actually annul those contracts. And so they've been doing a lot of this kind of stuff. And then they came up with a problem this year that was presented a real exciting opportunity in the case of this project here. So they've gotten somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 PDFs, mostly documents of Senate expenses. And how do you do real analysis of documents that are hardly machine readable and get through them relatively quickly when you only have one or two people working on this? You need an army. And so what they did was they leveraged some technology to build a crowdsourcing system, and they actually had citizens verify and pull information, metadata information about government, like the spending, vendors, the categories that things were spent on, who was spending the money, and so on. And they managed to, in a very short period of time, rip through 10,000 near 10,000 documents by leveraging the crowd. And so this is actually the page where they did it. And what's kind of cool is you can actually see over here, they've sort of gamified it, so you can see who their power users are, the people who have done the most documents, and there's kind of a leaderboard. And this is a great story, and this has been a great leader in this space, but the reality is not a lot of media are actually doing this in Latin America. They're really kind of unique, and they've done this because people in high positions came into this with a passion. This is something they wanted to do, but that's been a real barrier to getting this across media. And part of what we've been trying to do is actually help media understand the business opportunity and to see where this make a real business case for this. And so working at different levels of institutions. So I could dig into other examples, but that's been something that's been really important to making all of this work. Now this is nice given the panel that we have here. Info Amazonia is a project that's actually been a collaboration with Internews and ICFJ, being mutual supporters of this, but this is has been run out of an organization in Brazil called OECO, and it it maps open data affecting the environment of the Amazon. And so as you can see here, we're looking at a map of oil and gas of fields. And what they've been doing is layering things like mining, oil and gas, deforestation, forest fires, hydroelectric dams, and so on, all of these kinds of things that drive economic impact on countries and so on. And to try to basically, one, bring all this together in one place instead of a million sources, and two, be able to look for trends and back journalism with actual data. And they're now actually doing things like building in sensor systems to fact check the data sets themselves, to generate their own data sets, and also systems for fielding citizen reports to add ground reporting that will help back a lot of the data that you see here. And then we shift to the sort of civic hacking space, and this has been an area where we've seen a lot of opportunity. How do you take media and turn media into a sort of information service for people and help media rethink who they are and what they are, and their role in the community? And I'll grab a couple of examples from Africa, one of which is this in Kenya, Star Health. So with the Star media group in Kenya, built a very simple tool using open data, just a mashup of things that are out there like doctor information, hospital information, insurance information, and geodata, to be able to provide a simple answer to some basic questions that people experience in day-to-day lives. Dodgy doctors. So how do I find whether or not this doctor that I'm going to see is actually licensed and is not a veterinarian, for instance, which our fellow has actually had a direct experience with that. Justin Arnstein did have a little problem with going to a doctor who turned out not to be a doctor, which inspired this. Am I covered? So if I go to this hospital, will my insurance pay for that? And then finally, where's the nearest specialist? So these are real-world problems that people face that we wouldn't normally think of as journalism in a lot of these countries. And it's just taking data that's available and packaging it in a way so that people can access it very simply through, in this case, a website. And what's nice about it is it's simple, it's cheap to build, and it solves problems that are universal, so you can start replicating in other countries very, very quickly. Am I doing on time? A couple minutes? Cool. This is actually the last project I was going to highlight. So this is Got to Vote. And Got to Vote is talking about Kenya again. For the 2012 election, the government released a 1 gigabyte PDF that was, here's how you register to vote. And that's a real problem for people who are maybe in the village, who don't have access to the internet. How does somebody actually engage that? A 1 gigabyte PDF is hard for just about anyone, let alone villagers. So what they did is they scraped the information and put it into a very simple web and mobile application. You don't even need a smartphone to access this. They created a short code so you can actually call into it and verify your registration and find out, where do I vote? You can use the website or the mobile app to do this. And it is cheap. I mean, we're talking $500 for the short code and a couple days of developer time. And this is not something that media normally do, but you're talking about something that people come back to, that people will generate traffic, and it will solve people's immediate problems using data that government has made available that is simply inaccessible. And what's been exciting about this in particular is when we start talking about things like scale, this has been replicated in Zimbabwe, Ghana, and Malawi. They've used that for the elections that have happened in this past year there. For example, Malawi. And what was exciting about this is that it was actually adopted by the government as the official web solution for registration. So this is actually supported by the election commission there. So if you wanted to register to vote through the web, this is how you did it. And through this, at least 300,000 people were actually able to verify their registration to be able to vote in the election. 300,000 doesn't sound like a lot of people in a country where there's 7.5 million total people, not necessarily electorate. But when you're talking about this costs a very little amount of money to produce, 300,000 people otherwise would have had a real challenge to be able to access this. It's meaningful to them and is actually a pretty nice size. Once you start building, campaign around this and start building more and more, you can achieve even a greater scale. These have all been mostly experiments in the first time done in these countries, but have already achieved some pretty exciting results.
Good, fantastic.
Thanks, Ben. And now we're going to move to Craig. The World Bank has played a pretty important role in trying to bridge the gap between the broader development community and data journalism. And your work has focused a lot on the helping countries improve how to deal with government finance and how journalists can help explain how government finance is being used. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that work and how you see this integration issue between broader development and media development.
Sorry, I'm going to be that guy and stand over here.
Okay.
You want? Thank you very much. Okay. And this is going to be a little bit of a frolic, just so I can canter through some of this material and start, I think, just to kind of give you a little bit of context. And I think the goal here really is to start kind of an inverted pyramid approach to our conversation about what the bank's role is. I'm here as a member of the World Bank, but not speaking for the institution. That's an important distinction to make for those of us who are journalists in the room. But for our purposes, first of all, it's great to be here. Thank you very much. It's great to see everyone. We have all the marks are here today. It's nice to see you. Sheena in the back, Alex in the front. This is like a big family reunion. And of course, the good news is we do have the usual suspects up here. We've been able to work with every single member of this panel on more than one occasion, so it's great to be back. So what is this number? Anybody? Any suggestions? Any thoughts? Okay, well, I'll get it started. That is the number of loan grants, equity investments, and guarantees that the World Bank made last fiscal year. Okay? What about this? Successful ones. Oh, that's a good one. I think this is yours. No, very nice, very nice. This is the number of, this is the presence of the World Bank Group. This is the number of country offices that we have. Almost finished. What about this one? I better speed through this. I'm going to get wounded even more. All right, that's the number of developed indicators opened by the bank, including data on health, nutrition, infrastructure, water, sanitation, agriculture, gender, empowerment, inclusion, way more. We've got microdata on more than 650,000 variables from more than 1,200 surveys, and that's just now. 150,000 open reports, working papers, many of them collecting dust. Please do go look at them. I'll give you URLs in a minute. The point is the bank, as of 2010, has opened tremendous amounts of information. It's now circulating out there for free. And the question is, what exactly is media doing with this? One last quick number. What about this? That's our estimated lending capacity in 2024. So it's a large organization. It's got a big remit. And then, of course, there's little old me. Where do I fit? I'm just some guy in this organization who's really focused on trying to improve the bank's focus and support for media as a driver of good governance development, and as an infomediary, as a platform, as a transmission agent, as a catalyst for meaningful public participation in government decision making, as for meaningful feedback loops. Sheena in the bank has been doing this longer than I, and frankly should be the one who's standing up here, but I guess out of office email maybe on the memo. The bank's program focuses on three kind of key areas. That's legal regulatory reform support, including in the open data space, including access to information, executing legislation for media reforms, and other freedom of expression and association reform processes. Capacity development, you'll hear about that in a minute, but also institutional strengthening. So what we're talking about here, again, inverted pyramid, is what the bank is doing to support the creation and availability of open data out in space so that media and other constituencies can make use of it for improved decision making at all levels, on the government and outside of government. We talked about this. This is a shameless plug to give you a sense of where some of this information is. But just to give you a sense of kind of what these interfaces look like, you essentially have data on more than 210 countries, principalities, and other geographic arrangements around the world. Importantly, we're also opening our own information. Our own lending portfolio is now wide open. The amounts of grants, lending arrangements, guarantees, and other bank instruments is also made available here, so that you can actually get a sense of what our projects are doing, what money we're investing in support and development processes across regions, across contexts, what that actually looks like, and who's getting it in order to actually facilitate these changes and development processes that we're trying to support. So in the data space, so in addition to running the Open Government Data Media Program, I sit on the bank's Open Data Working Group, which is effectively an internal committee that handles the bank's open data processes. This is an assortment of different staff that come from across the institution that care about open data and are trying to find a way to operationalize it, but importantly, how to cascade it across the institution. How data and open data can be a driver of development, but as a cross-cutting solutions area, not just in specific contexts like governance, which is where I work, but also across the board, and how we can work with government, but also non-government actors in this space in order to try to facilitate and enable this information to really inform decision-making at multiple levels. This, for example, there's no URL, so never mind. But the point is that this is one indication of what the bank is trying to do in order to bring in non-government actors into the conversation. This includes things like training programs, available resources, and even things like readiness assessments, so that national and subnational open data initiatives can be supported by the bank. The goal, of course, and this is something that we've seen often, is we're trying to move from where we are in many contexts. In this case, this is, I think, to a different state of being, basically, to kind of get from here to here to here, and then in order to try to find a way to share knowledge and information, move it across regions and networks and contexts so that you can see what's working where, why, and how you can even replicate it if it's working as well. I'm taking a bit of a global approach here, and so how you can actually do things like create and enable a broader ecosystem around open data processes that we find at national and subnational levels. You've heard Ben, you heard Ida talk about these things, and you see a lot of training programs. I hope we're going to have a really honest conversation about what training looks like and where it works, where it doesn't. The bank in particular has a lot of experience with how things don't always work. We have done a lot of kind of hit and run kind of activities which don't have a lot of impact over longer term, but this is something I think we're working on to go deep a bit more. There's a conversation, I think, about how you can catalyze conversations around open data in the first instance and then go deep on a longer period in order to provide meaningful, systemic, iterative engagement in order to really build capacity that's lasting. But again, bearing in mind, we're trying to use open data to really solve challenging, wicked problems that you find in many different contexts around the world. I'm glad Ben had mentioned a couple of these things because we're talking about how that knowledge and information can flow between contexts as well so that you're not starting from scratch in one place and another place and another place. A good example, I think, is Moldova. Alex was there with us, in fact. This is back in 2012, and just to kind of give you an interesting follow-up on where things happened, it was a transmission of information and experience that went from Kenya to Moldova, and as many of you may know, Moldova launched its own open data initiative back in 2011. Here's some statistics about what its open data platform looks like. In many ways, it was guided by the Kenyan example. I chose this one specifically because Edith's here, Ben's here, Tara was actually with us around that time as well and knows very much about what the Kenyan experience looks like. Of course, Mark was instrumental in media development at the bank for quite some time. So in the knowledge and experience transmission from Kenya to Moldova, that was deliberate, we see things, for example, like inspiration coming from other contexts and informing the Moldovan perspective on how news media can make use of information that's been opened and turn it into accessible, digestible, pithy information that the public can use and make decisions. So the Nigerian context, for example, informed the Moldovan experience in terms of actually writing things like budget stories. In this case, the Philippines examples about how you can actually geolocate schools and whether or not they have their textbooks and their teachers are showing up also informed the Moldovan context about checking their own schools. You've seen, for example, how legislatures are working or not working, and the accountability of elected officials in Uruguay informing the Moldovan experience about tracking promises and making sure that elected officials are doing what they're supposed to be doing or what they're saying they're doing. We have a new paradigm, of course, here, recognizing that this is an online conversation. Part of what I think we need to be talking about here is that there are offline aspects of this conversation we have got to dig into. It's wonderful to be able to show a lot of really interesting, creative, unique apps. Those that we're talking about here were driven primarily by media organizations in order to try to proliferate information in a useful and accessible way. But there are a lot of people on this planet that do not have internet connections. One potential opportunity, however, is, of course, beaming internet in from space, which is another conversation maybe later on we can talk about. The bank is interested in this as well, and it's actually supporting this organization to start experimenting in fragile and conflict-affected states. But the reality of the situation is that the offline conversation is not, it doesn't always play too much into the open data and data journalism conversation. We have got to focus on it. The heavy thing you heard me drop was this. This is the national budget for Bangladesh, okay? And I realize that pulling it out like this is bad theater, but the point is just by starting, for example, to put it on one of these, is moving in the right direction, and you're making it accessible and digestible to more people more often. But importantly, the kinds of engagement, whoa, I think that was on this, let me just, okay. Jinkies, 1 second, folks. Okay, here we go. Okay, but what we're talking about now is in addition to the kind of the new forward-thinking engagement with media as this driver of the conversation about why open data is useful and how they can use it and fold it into their reporting and into the public space for public comprehension and digestion and informing other decisions at multiple levels for people who are consuming media, we still have to come back to basics, as Edith said. In many cases, if you don't start with a numeracy engagement, or in this case, a budget literacy engagement, what have I done? Okay, help. Here we go, all right. You're getting media, for example, recognizing that they have a role in the conversation around budget processes. And through numeracy, through budget literacy, through data literacy, which are processes that you have got to invest time and money and human capital on, it's possible for the media to really appreciate what their role is, start really percolating information into the public consciousness that informs how people are making decisions. It informs how government officials are actually responding to key issues that are being raised by the public, and whether or not they are, in fact, being responsive to the public on issues that they care about. And so the more you see in the Bangladesh context, for example, just, again, calls for more transparency, recognizing the role of media as an accountability, as an institution of accountability, recognizing that there are reforms that need to happen, and having media, for example, be the one to catalyze those reforms is important. This process, for example, is also happening in Tanzania, where, again, through media analysis of budget data, through these kinds of processes, you recognize that there are tremendous amounts of waste, and as a result, you have 8 ministers, for example, resigning for portfolio mismanagement. So, I mean, the bank, as it's is an institution which cares about open data. It's something that we really value. We recognize that there's a long way to go. Frankly, what I'm here is to hear from you, so I'm going to shut up in about 10 seconds. But the most important thing is that please understand that it's a continuing process, and we're learning as we go. The data aren't perfect. Ida's right, all right? But it's not the point for the data to be perfect. It has to be out there. And through triangulation and analysis and continued efforts to refine the quality and scope of what we're trying to do, hopefully we'll get this conversation to the place where it needs to be. Now, we're also holding ourselves accountable to that. So if you go, this is the President's Delivery Unit, for example. So part of the process also is, like I said, to cascade the open data conversation across the bank's deliveries. And if you look, part of the process, this little tiny thing over here, that's the bank's accountability to be as transparent as possible with its own aid data. But that development indicator is also more broadly inclusive about what the bank is doing to support our clients to open their own data. And you can see we're not doing so great so far. So it's a continuing process, but there's a long way to go. And again, I just want to thank you for your time. Cheers.
Great. Thank you, Craig.
I'll get that later.
Yeah, that's great. So let's now move to Tara, who I said has done a paper on this for CIMA. It was a really comprehensive sort of overlook of this field, some of the challenges and opportunities in this space, and since you've kind of covered it across the board, I wonder what kinds of lessons would you draw from the conversation we've had so far? What would you be? What would you take from this as having done this work in the past?
Well, I also want to say thanks for having me on this panel. It's really great to be here and great to see everyone excited and kind of engaged about this issue. I wanted to start actually Ben's comment at the beginning about sort of that probably actually all of us are here because we believe and we know that media and information matter for economic development and for governance. And I wanted to kind of frame a bit with some work that actually Mark and I collaborated on a few years ago called the Media Map Project that asks exactly that question. So we believe it, but does media matter for development? And is there evidence? And sort of to make a long story short, yes and yes. But if this isn't known by governments, by the general public, by civil society, if the journalists aren't reporting on this in a concrete way so that people can do something about this information, it will change, right? So as Mark said, the funding for media development is a very small part of funding for development overall because this message somehow hasn't gotten out. So I think it's sort of an interesting way to sort of start thinking about how data journalism could be a game changer in many ways for how journalism, how media, for how information technology can integrate and sort of promote development just by being what it is. So I think that actually the 3 panelists did a really excellent job of talking about all of these things, about sort of talking about opportunities, about talking about challenges and lessons, and giving some really concrete and wonderful examples. So I think maybe what I'll do is just try and step back and kind of pull a bit of kind of the general principles of what I heard and also some of what I saw in the paper. So some of the trends and opportunities, I mean, some of this may be a bit obvious, but I think it's worth saying. I mean, trend, explosion of data, right? So one of the things when I started off the paper was actually just sort of wondering, what's going on and why now? And it seemed to be a confluence of a lot of really interesting factors that are not only enabling data journalism, but are also constraining it in interesting ways. So there's with sort of the digitalization of everything, there's a production of a lot of data that even statisticians whose job it is to work with this kind of data are sort of falling behind, let alone the journalists that are sort of protesting about having to use numbers. And then sort of global increases, as I think all the panelists said, in trying to increase transparency and accountability, both from sort of the top down and from the bottom up. And tied to open data movements that are trying to get governments like Kenya to open the data, sometimes at a very slow pace, but there is definitely sort of a push and a trend. And running parallel this, but incredibly significant, is also the just incredible commercial investment in analyzing data to understand consumer behavior. Many of this data journalists may never get access to, but it's something I think that's worth trying to do, and it's something that's sort of running alongside with the data work that we're talking about here. Other things that have been sort of pushing data journalism forward is, as I think all the panelists have said, is sort of increasing access to the internet, to technology, simplification of tools. So for what 40 years ago you would need an incredible amount of money, a mainframe computer, and who has access to a mainframe computer to do reporting on a project can now be done if you have a bit of skills and access to the internet, a multi-faceted team, but nonetheless, in some ways, much easier to do. And then trends in, again, as reflected in what many people said, sort of sharing openness and collaboration as a new way of working, as networking, as a new way of working. I mean, this data journalism relies on these things, and I think is coming out of these things as well. And then in terms of journalism, I think journalists are always interested in establishing credibility, right? And this is one way in which they can do it. I think, in a very basic sense, journalists have to sort of report on the important information that is happening in society, and a lot of the important information that's being produced now is in data. So if they don't understand how to do it, then we're sort of missing an entire side of the story. Opportunities, I think Ben mentioned about potentially strengthening the business model for media, which those of us in media development struggle with this a lot. How do you sustain media as a business, especially if you're a media developer and you've invested in it, and over again. We saw this in our earlier research. Donors go away, and a lot of time projects collapse. But there have been a lot of hints that, whether it's by potentially trying to sell databases, through some research that showed that in several countries, young people are more and more expecting to pay for content in the future, to other kinds of already engagement with online data services, that there's some hints that they're strengthen the business model for journalism here. And then, of course, sort of back to the question at the beginning, to sort of demonstrate and support journalism's importance to development, that journalists should be tracking, whether it's using World Bank data or otherwise, tracking how development is doing, and not just to say, these are the number of projects that fail, but also say what succeeded and why, and how do we know, and how can we make connections across different things. In the sort of in the run-up to the sort of post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals, one of the things that the high-level panel sort of declared was that there would be a data revolution, but sort of without funding for National Statistics Office to collect the data and collect it well, make it interoperable, clean it, all these issues that we talked about, and without journalists that are able to really translate this for the public, then how is there really going to be a data revolution? So I think that media's role is very, very tied to how well development does in tracking how well it does. So a few quick challenges. Sort of, I think, as everyone said, just opening data. It's not open data, and they will come and they will know. That's definitely not enough. There's quite a bit more challenge. data journalism, I talk to a lot of data journalists, and data journalism is not easy. There are no quick wins. And a lot of the pioneer data journalists that I talked to had actually sort of seemed to coincidentally be choosing early on in their careers between a career in sort of statistics or a career in journalism, or a career in computers and a career in journalism. And so they naturally were inclined to do both. But for sort of most of the rest of probably a lot of other journalists, it's not quite such an easy marriage of two things. So how do you create that? Relative to other development projects, perhaps it is cheap, but from the perspective of a newsroom, it's not cheap, right? So if you don't have a sort of additional funding, you need to put together a multidisciplinary team, get them to work together, get them to understand each other's language, and then it's really investigative journalism. So that's in many newsrooms on the outs anyway, with the sort of 24/7 news cycle and get it done very quickly. It's a very hard sell, and newsrooms still tend to be very conservative and slow to change, and so investing in something that the data may not be there may not actually be a story in the data, it takes a lot of faith. So that leads to the question of sort of how do you institutionalize things in the newsroom? I think that's I don't have the answer at all, but I think it's a really good question. I think maybe it starts with the newsroom, then goes to the sector level, then sort of country and across border. How do you really build in a data journalism culture? From the research that I did, what I saw was that it never came from the top down, that it was always one very strong, very fierce, very excellent sort of pioneer data journalist that managed to create kind of a coalition in the newsroom, get buy-in from editors, get buy-in from the board, and just show through some excellent, basically, proof of concept through their work. But I don't know that that's the right answer, but I think we need some thinking about how that should be done. Then there's the question of sort of broader editorial support. In many media houses, sort of the leaders are sort of tied to the government, so do they really want the media to play that watchdog role? And then perhaps the most significant and the most basic challenge is just the challenges to journalism more generally, right? Data journalism is a part of journalism. Many people that I talked to said, it's just investigative journalism, don't call it something different. So all of the problems that we know about access to information and free media and the enabling environment and even basic safety, capture of the media, the list goes on and on. But again, those problems are of course the same for data journalism as well. So maybe I'll just talk briefly about a few of sort of needs or kind of lessons. So maybe the flip side of what I said is that there seems to be sort of a family of characteristics that are welcoming to data journalism, but I think they're probably the characteristics that are welcoming to journalism more broadly. That would be, an open society with a strong freedom of information laws, but also better education, more access to data, and then wired, right? So there is a pretty strong divide, but because there's all this new cool tools and great capacity when you have access to the internet, ability to network, ability to collaborate. When you don't have that, then what are you going to do? You can't go back to the mainframe. So it's a huge challenge. Also, I think the culture of collaboration is not something to take lightly. Are people used to collaborating with each other across disciplines, or even just at all? I think is a huge. It's a huge challenge. So, when we think about it from a media development perspective, how do we improve data journalism? It has to broader. We have to still be thinking about improving the broader environment for journalists generally, and how do we really incentivize the media for doing these kinds of stories? How do we build demand in countries for this kind of these kind of stories? And I don't mean just governments. I also mean citizens, which means, this is another challenge perhaps, is are citizens data literate? Do they understand, even when journalists make beautiful graphics, does it mean anything to them or not? And so that's a question on the citizen side and a question on the journalist side at all, but it's unless someone is engaging with the content, consuming it, doing something about it, then that's only sort of half the battle. The question of capacity among journalists, which everyone talked about here, I looked at there were at least sort of actually 6 different models of building capacity for journalists, which made me sort of happy that there, I mean, maybe because we're relatively early on in the game of funding media development, data journalism, that there are actually a lot of different approaches. So there may not be any one approach that's right, but I think for sure, because this data journalism is really hard to do, you know, there's no quick win. I mean, there are, one of the oldest, NICAR, the National Institute for Computer Assisted Reporting at the University of Missouri here in the US, is perhaps the institution that's been doing data journalism training the longest. They say that they created the boot camp. So there's been a lot of questions about the effectiveness of boot camps. You know, you go in for 2 weeks, you work very intensely, and then what? But I think the thing to remember is that is it a boot camp in a vacuum? Is it just a boot camp? So with NICAR, they also have work on community building. They also work on networking. They also do conferences. So it's a question about how do you do long-term engagement? How do you do deep and long-term engagement? I don't know that there's one solution, but I think that's the perspective to look from. And even the most accomplished data journalists will say that you don't learn and then you're done and then that's it. And then you go up. No, because tools are changing, because data's, you know, amount of data is increasing, because the way it's released is changing. Data journalists need to be sort of ongoingly training themselves and understanding how to go. So there's, for no one is there a sort of a quick start and stop. It needs to be sort of a long, thought out and engaged kind of process. So let's see if there's anything else that I want to say. I mean, I guess it's just to sort of end. I mean, there's probably a lot of other lessons, but I think I do have some hope that you know, data journalism will provide a new opportunity to sort of re-engage with a broader development, sort of to answer your question at the beginning, just because sort of, you know, data is the new black with the development community as much as with anybody else. And the data journalists understand how to use it, and they understand how to talk to both sides. So I do feel very hopeful, but I feel there's a lot of work to be done.
Great. That was a really good introduction to the whole realm of issues that I think come into this space. And I think it might be better if we open up to questions at this point. I've got several questions myself, but I want to go to Mark first. And maybe we'll take 3 questions at a time. We'll go to you next. And if there's one other, one down here. Okay, we'll go to these 3 questions, and then we'll answer them 3 at a time. So we'll start with Mark here, and then you, okay?
Okay, so Mark Koenig from USAID. I want to thank everybody for just excellent presentations. I noticed that many of the best examples come from countries that are closer to middle levels of development, Kenya, Moldova, Brazil, Argentina, Latin America. My question is, to what extent can we take the best practices from these cases and apply them to countries at much lower levels of digital development, economic development? I know one example given, I think it was by Ben, was Malawi, so it is possible. But I'm just wondering to what extent the lessons learned from these primarily kind of middle-level country examples can be applied in the countries of the greatest developmental need.
Good question. Okay, we'll go here. Tell us who you are.
Sure. Alex Howard from Tech Republic. I appreciated that report a great deal. Last year I got to write a research report in data journalism as well for the Tao Center, and a lot of these issues came up as I talked to a lot of people. One of the persistent ones in media, of course, is that the ability to report has been democratized. When we talk about journalism, I often talk about acts of journalism, particularly around governments, because it's useful to discuss those around civic media, citizen media, et cetera. And so that naturally leads itself to the discussion of data journalism as the capacity for people to create acts of data journalism. And I usually define that as adding fact-checking and context. That's what differentiates it, something from a report. It moves it forward to that. And I don't think there was ever a point, at least I didn't hear it, where we defined what data journalism was versus something else. We gave lots of examples of things we might call it. You know, I struggled with that a lot too for about, you know, tens of thousands of words. But one of the things I'd love to draw out of this panel here is if we could look at things like some of these civic apps, Ben pointed to some of these other things, and the discussion of living stories or software applications that are not being created by journalists, but are serving civic functions that are being powered by data from multiple sources that may be acts of journalism, but move far beyond. And then at what point do those kinds of creations, you know, interact with people in developing countries through mobile interfaces and change the way that development or governance occurs? If you can point to some of those and maybe dig into some of those issues too.
Okay, good. We have one right back here.
ATFB. My question is about Iraq. Just to help maybe get the conversation become more timely and more relevant to the headlines. I'm interested to learn about mostly Internews, maybe other World Bank experience in Iraq. How open the system to releasing data to journalists, and how could this experience be utilized to help the government and other interested parties improve the security in the country, especially protecting the civilians in the streets, in the markets, in the schools, who are being killed every day by these suicide attacks.
Good. Okay, let's, Ida, do you want to start with?
Yeah. Okay, great. So I really appreciated the question about low development countries, and like the point very much about acts of journalism, or acts of data journalism, which is a kind of a nice phrase by, I think, yeah, Alex. I mean, we use the phrase as well, which was coined by whoever wrote We the Media, right? Okay. So, and then I've tried to attempt to answer the Iraq question. But I think, I mean, as we were talking, it struck me that, I mean, none of us had actually put a finger on it, but what we're really talking about is a whole continuum of journalism. Much as journalism, general journalism before data journalism was there, can be just opening a mic and speaking on the radio, on a community radio station, or can be Watergate, you know, that entire really huge continuum. So it can be with data journalism or acts of data journalism. There can be those apps, sort of pure informational type applications, which are really for or even by citizens, and incredibly useful, incredibly meaningful information to have in many settings. And on the opposite, on the extreme end of the continuum, it can be what Assange and Snowden did with The Guardian, and the kind of stories that come from sort of really being able to look at really huge data sets and coming into, you know, getting to significant insights, which is of course also for citizens, but not necessarily by citizens. But I like the crowdsourcing example you mentioned, because that's also by citizens. With regard to lower digital, lower settings of lower digital development, I mean, if some of the great principles of data journalism can also be used even in these high digital countries, like Kenya. Kenya has villages where there is no internet and so on. And what we've done with journalists there is to sort of apply some of the best principles of data journalism, and we call it village data. Again, sort of led by the fact that evidence, rather than the fact that somebody thinks something is the case, makes for a more compelling story. A chief in a village, a headmaster at a school may have data on the number of girls who are pregnant or out of school because there's poor sanitation at school, out of school certain times of the month for that matter, because there's poor sanitation at the school. And that is data journalism. That's kind of like the headmaster saying, you know, so many girls in the school are pregnant and they don't go to school, and what that does for girls' education versus boys' education, and how, you know, that impacts on the girl's life, of course, and society more broadly. You know, we can bring those principles into an offline type storytelling too. But it is a challenge because, I mean, data journalism fares best when you can manipulate data with the tools that are available. Iraq, I really don't know, but I do know that Internews has data journalism programs in Afghanistan and China now, also really closed societies. We're increasingly, through pressure in various forms, sometimes these are projects that aren't necessarily so well known, but that we actually work with the various agencies to push at it. Like Craig said, it's important that the data is out there. It may not be clean, it may not be accurate, but we've got to start with it, whether it's citizen-driven apps and purely about the information, or whether it gets to the middle range of sort of more sophisticated data analysis and data journalism, or whether it's the kind of really at the extreme end, coming into major insights that help us understand our world better.
Ben, do you have any thoughts on Iraq?
I haven't worked there. Can't offer much there. I think I could answer the other two questions. But although ICFJ has certainly done work in Iraq, but I haven't been involved. On the low income country question, I mean, we're a product to some extent of our funding, and our funding from the Gates Foundation has focused on some targeted countries that don't necessarily qualify as low income, the lowest income. On the Knight side, we're extremely opportunity driven, and we've found it very challenging when we've worked in the lowest income countries. So we've tended to have our better results a step above. But I don't think that means you can't do this stuff, because oftentimes, and back to the point about like you're talking about villagers in Kenya who are very far away and disconnected from a lot of technology opportunities and also economic levels, higher economic levels. I mean, that's where we focus a lot of our work, and I think it absolutely can be done. I mean, as long as there's, let's say, a mobile phone, something can be done with that. You can get information out of it. You can get information to it and do meaningful data journalism. Certainly you need economic centers to have access to some technology, but I mean, every country at some point has an economic center that has access to technology, and it's about finding creative ways to at least engage those audiences with what they have access to. But I'd actually like to focus a little bit more on Alex's question, as I think it speaks to a really important, I think they're all great questions, but I think it speaks to something important that I didn't quite define earlier, and I think it's a good topic. What do we mean by journalism? We don't operate with our projects under the assumption that journalism is only something that news organizations do or traditional news organizations do. We spend a lot of our energy connecting the dots between different types of stakeholders who are, the info activists and technology companies and universities and civil society organizations and so on, because they're all important stakeholders in this space. And so we do, to a large extent, we foster acts of journalism as opposed to just building up news organizations. Although news organizations, for reasons I listed earlier, are a critical element because of the reach that they have, because of the audience, because they have a methodology and an ability to process and communicate and engage people into information. And one last thing I want to say is, I think increasingly the civic tech space is important, as there's a lot of emphasis now in how do you help government be more innovative and engaging citizens, and how do you help empower citizens into society around them. I recommend, if you are familiar with the Sunlight Foundation, Emily Shaw wrote a really nice post recently on civic tech wants, civic tech needs, civic tech, something like that. Anyway, so it was great because she talked a lot about how do you, and this is back to the low-income question, how do you engage people who are distant from government? I'm not going to speak on her behalf here, but I recommend you look it up, and maybe somebody can find it and tweet it. But it was really good because it got inside of a lot of these kinds of issues, and I think media can play an important role in that space because of its ability to access audience, but also because of its opportunity when there are data-starved countries where there isn't a lot of open data. Oftentimes media and civil society organizations can be the sources of data. As they are getting information, they can put it and package it in a way so they can actually become the data for the country when the government is not putting it out there.
Okay, let's go back to the audience now, and we'll let you guys comment on the next questions. Do we have any other questions from people in the audience? Good.
The question is, what is your advice for journalists who want to adopt data journalism in their countries where there's no access to information laws in place?
Very good question. Okay, you have one?
I was just a little curious about the offline conversation, if there are any major projects you guys know about other than the whole Zuckerberg thing, maybe with the World Bank that's looking to put internet in more rural areas of countries that are below mid-level, as that gentleman said.
Yes, okay. Anybody else? We'll take one more if there's one more. If not, we'll go, Craig, you want to start?
Sure. So I guess just in order, the legal and regulatory enabling environment for media, free expression, and information is obviously the desired steady state for a reasonable, long-term media engagement, but it's just not reality in most of the countries we end up working in. So as a result, in many cases, the determination has been, there is no wrong moment to start a data journalism or open data, because in many cases, they've actually been started by non-government actors. If you look at a range of different, let's call them open data or open data movements or initiatives or processes which have identified data-driven decision-making as a priority, in many cases, they are non-government actors that are the ones who are raising this as a priority and are scraping their own data from available resources or putting them onto civic platforms without the participation of government. And so, as a result, I don't think there is a wrong time to engage kind of meaningfully in open data or data-driven journalism conversations and processes. That said, it is easier when there is an access to information law in the books. Kenya, actually, is a fantastic example of this. The ATI bill has finally been tabled before Parliament after about, 2006, 2005? So yeah, the bill itself is 2012. The conversation started in 2005. It's tabled before Parliament. It'll hopefully get passed or at least reviewed this for next calendar year. But the Kenya Open Data Initiative started in 2011. So it's possible for these things to exist. They're not. One is easier when you have the other, but they're not mutually exclusive. It's not a binary conversation of if this, then that.
Do you think it drives or creates incentives for the government to try to move in that direction? Does it change the conversation in a way on the question of open, freedom, free journalists?
Yeah, I do think I think the existence of an Access to Information Act does change the barometric pressure of conversations at government.
No, but I mean, data journalism. Like, yeah. If you would work with journalists to concentrate on improving their skills on this area, does that create incentives for the government to be a little bit more open about saying, okay, maybe we do need to be less repressive against the media space?
I think the higher the capacity of journalists to be able to work with the data, the more amenability certain government bodies are to releasing the information. I think in many cases you see, this is painting with a broad brush, but many national statistics agencies would love to get their data used by more than the existing contingency of data users on the government side. A lot of individual government agencies have already taken the precaution of releasing that sounds kind of dire. Have taken the precaution, have already taken the steps to open their own information in the absence of an open data policy or in the absence of an Access to Information Act. And so, I think you find it's a variable equation. Again, it's not black or white, but I do think that the higher the capacity, the more journalists are working with the data, the more amenable many governments that have data would be to releasing it, particularly if it's good news.
No.
And maybe also just to sort of not imagine that, all will be okay once there is open access to information. I mean, it needs, as we've said, it's a step-by-step process. There are a lot of data sets that aren't secret, that come from institutions like the WHO or whatever, which journalists could practice with in order to kind of get this evidence-based approach going and build confidence and build capacity, which, yes, does, I also believe the kind of the confidence that creates in journalists to be able to create evidence-based stories, creates the confidence also to be this bottom-up push for open access, for a better regulatory system. So in other words, don't encourage them to wait until the data is there, the data that is available and open and internationally available.
Good.
And I just wanted to look at that question from yet another angle, which is the capacity angle. I mean, I don't know sort of what country or context the person was asking, but they are on Twitter, so there's some kind of access there. So I think it's what's amazing about the age that we're living in is again the question of networking and collaboration. I think, I would say, find your people. Start a Hackers chapter. I mean, there was a beautiful quote I thought in my report by Miguel Paz about Hackers, about it being an open source idea of just bringing together journalists and developers and just other people interested in data journalism to learn how to collaborate and learn to each other. And there have been some very, very powerful examples of that, particularly in Latin America, but in other places as well. But also, again, if you have access to online, there are a lot of there are MOOCs, these massive open online courses, which have their problems, but are some kind of entryway into data journalism. There are toolkits and tricks, and again, very difficult if you're in a vacuum, but there are resources, and if you can sort of manage to network and find your people, I think there's a way to begin to build capacity. Again, it takes sort of a commitment and knowing that this is going to be ongoing learning, but I think there are ways to sort of self-build capacity as well.
That's great. Okay. And do we have anything else? Okay. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Okay.
If I look at that poster up there, I don't have the choice to read the words because I can't see them. So I look at the pictures, and what kind of works for me, I see the graphics, I see the pictures. And some talk to me, some don't. How do I know that those particular kind of pictures, those stick men or the graphs or the maps with colors, mean anything to anyone in Ouagadougou or Johannesburg for that matter? How much work has been done on the actual semiotics of it at the end result of all this process of mining data, finding data, getting journalists? How do we know anyone can make anything of that?
Good point. Okay. Go ahead. Introduce yourself too.
Sure. My name is Mohammed Najm from Social Media Exchange Lebanon. My question is specifically about the threat on journalists. We've seen a lot of journalists who have been killed lately. And my question is there any programs in place to protect journalists who really want to adopt those kind of data journalism?
Okay. And then Alex, you have one more?
I wanted to challenge an assertion that because a lot more journalists are using the data, the governments will open it up. You could make an argument that there are more data journalists working today in the United States than there ever has been, and yet government is denying FOIA requests at a rate that have never been seen before. The big story in the New York Times right now is that there were chemical weapons in Iraq. C.J. Shivers did that reporting using data-driven methods that they got under the Freedom of Information Act. That wasn't because the Pentagon disclosed it. So it wasn't that there was a demand, it was that under the law we have here, it has to be released. So there's something in that report that's really important, and it's the extent to which doing data journalism is dependent upon there being press freedom laws and access to information laws, and the extent to which governments can claim that they're being open by releasing open data about the things they want to be open about versus the ones that journalism is traditionally focused upon, which is the things that people in power don't tell you. So is there a chance that they can claim that they're being open because of open data?
Okay. Who wants to start?
I loved your question. I love your question. This one about how do we know that this is actually solving people's problems and reaching them and so forth. I mean, I think that's a real problem. It gets back to Alex's earlier question. I mean, what do we mean when we talk about data journalism? And so this is certainly an example. But I would argue that it's the role of the journalist to answer exactly those questions. So just because you've made what some people consider data porn, which is just a nice pretty picture that tells a story that people may or may not understand, is to actually examine those underlying assumptions and to actually look into this and say, okay, we've done this story, but have we actually moved the needle for everyday people, and is this something that actually addresses their problems and potentially solves them? So, I mean, that's really the thinking that we try to do. This is a nice, and this is not to, I'm not criticizing this, but this would be maybe a starting point or a point along the way to lead toward that. And I'm glad you raised that, because I think that's something that anyone in this space needs to emphasize, solving that problem without going on a long, like, hour-long examples and things like that.
Alex, I think your question about challenging the assumption is very important, because I thought, as I was saying, that we really are kind of data evangelists and should also be, should note what the dangers are of kind of some of the assumptions made around data journalism. Somewhat related to your point is the fact that, of course, a huge danger with data journalism is this veneer, this sense that it is evidence-based. But what if there was a mistake with the interpretation? So it kind of actually can even be more dangerous than if you were simply quoting what somebody said, because at least this is really what the person said, but is this really what the data said? Yeah, certainly, I mean, this country is a good example of, what we all assume to have really, to be about really great data access, and your examples board. So it's a kind of nice grounding point that you've made. To the other point about the infographics, that's actually something that interests me a lot personally. So we did a tiny study in Kenya through, with support from our DC office, and put together some focus groups and some one-on-one interviews with folks, and actually exposed them to some of these data infographics that we are, so enthused by and find so cute and so engaging and so on. And we wanted to know exactly this, what do people make of the data? It's the visual literacy that comes along with data literacy and with this new kind of storytelling. It was quite interesting. So we exposed people to kind of the same content when it was text and picture, and it was only picture, and of course then went into some more depth around what people made of the different types, they're very fascinating bubble graphs that really work well online, that you can find in that wonderful book, Information is Beautiful, where if you've grown up in an era of data, of info literacy, and you know semiotics, you possibly instantly know what everything means. But if you've been exposed to only print, and suddenly there are these pictures, what does it actually mean if, if 3 of the men are blue and 2 are red? Do people necessarily know what that means? So the conclusions were, it was a really small study, I should say. I'd love for us, for all of us in this group, to kind of think about that more, about what is the visual literacy. Is it different in different contexts? Is there a universal visual literacy that we're just assuming, or is it different for different countries? In Kenya, the findings were very much about if people felt that the people looked like them, wore perhaps, dress that was typical for their region, they related more to the pictures. I think there is also a danger in that, in the same way that if something becomes too specific and too hyperlocal, you could also start sort of perhaps suggesting that it's a certain tribe or only a certain gender that does this or that. So it's a really new, interesting era that this has opened up. And even perhaps the look of certain apps. We may just assume that people know where to click and what it means and what a drop-down menu is, but it's not always as logical as we may think.
So one quick, I think,
okay,
position.
One
also,
quickie.
Quick way, and which this is just to come also back to Alex, which is, I think we're, when we have, kind of conferences and panels on the value and glory of data journalism, I think we run the risk of overstating the value of what we're talking about. I mean, it's one kind of facet, it's one data point in space. It's not a panacea. It's not going to solve government transparency problems, and a government is or is not going to decide what to do based on the extent to which the public is using or consuming the information alone. I think that is a factor. I think it's very easy to make the case that an open data initiative is not working if you don't have the number of page views that people are looking at, or some arbitrary number or amount of consumption. So I do think that it's possible to make the case, at least in some of the countries we're supporting, that by virtue of journalists and civil society and other kind of data user constituencies making use of the data, that by virtue of that use, it is an incentive, or government is amenable to continuing to keep some of that information open. Now, that's not a commentary on what data sets they're willing to open. That's a different conversation, I think. I think that level of the levels of transparency should run parallel, and it should be informed by what the public is looking for, what it's asking for. It's very telling, I think, also that many open data initiatives did not start with some kind of civic engagement process to identify what people care about to inform what data is open. These are processes which are starting. And we saw one in Nigeria, for example, has recently started that process with surfacing public opinion, public demand, to inform what its own open government data strategy will look like. It's a long process. I don't know that it's going to get there, but it's a step maybe in the right direction.
Okay, we're really out of time, but I thought there was one more question. Yeah?
Well, the gentleman back there asked security.
Oh, yeah, the unanswered question. Is anybody from Committee to Protect Journalists here, or?
Protecting journalists who,
Protecting journalists. I mean, what I would say to that is that the whole question of protection of journalists is a major issue that is being dealt with by a multiple group of people and different organizations that are trying to deal with those kinds of issues, whether it's on data journalism or other kinds of journalism. I don't think they make a lot of distinction between this. I do think that the experience of the East Asian economies suggests that there are authoritarian regimes who are more willing to entertain certain kinds of openness in certain areas, and to, step by step, to gradually open up their environments. And this was the case in Korea. It was the case in Japan. It was the case in many Singapore, where the government started off being very, very oppressive towards journalists and gradually allowed certain kinds of data to get into public space. And one could hope that we would be able to replicate this, because I have to say that when you look at the data about what's happening in terms of freedom and the ability of journalists to practice their craft in the world, we are not going in the right direction. We're going in the wrong direction. It's getting worse. So, we need to look at different kinds of opportunities and approaches that might create new conversations. And I do think that when a government comes to the World Bank or to a donor and starts talking about, I want to have an open data initiative, and I want to join the Open Data Club of nations, that is an opportunity to say, well, for that to work, somebody's got to make sense of this data. It's not going to immediately jump out onto the open space and make sense to people. It's going to require the work of journalists. It's going to require an open and free media. And that's where I think we've got to try to push this agenda in that direction, because if we don't, that whole realm of the ability of people to practice independent, free, open, and the kind of useful journalism that makes sense of all this in an open way will not happen. And that's why we wanted to have this event today. I think it is a hopeful kind of area that is starting to have some energy behind it. And I want to thank our panelists for giving us a lot of great information and data. And I hope we can continue this conversation next year, where we'll have many new countries and examples of success. Thank you very much for joining us.